the non-sovereignty of Christ and the end of sacrifice, toward a phenomenology of Christian pacifism. Following Ren Girard, the analysis of religion and violence has often been framed by discussions of sacrifice. Religious violence comes in the form of sacrifice, either of another or oneself, to whatever is considered sacred. The sacred, which represents ultimate meaning or loyalty, is allowed to manifest itself through violence only because the idea of the sacrifice allows us to defend these loyalties at any cost. This may occur either through a scapegoat, as in Girard, or through the operation of the sovereign, as in Paul Kahn's recent book, Sacred Violence. Both these authors recognize that so-called secular loyalties of Western citizenship may also function as sacred, which only serves to broaden the relevance of the sacrificial model. If indeed most forms of violence in our world are products of systems of sacrifice, it becomes important to understand the religious motivations behind violence, even when this violence masquerades as simply rational or political. One of the most pressing questions of our day is how to unmask and incapacitate these sacrificial systems. Perhaps not surprisingly for a discussion in the Christian West, Christ has been one of the key symbols in the attempt to understand, criticize, and transcend the violence of sacrifice. Girard, for instance, believes that the Gospels have permanently disclosed the scapegoat mechanism that relieves societies from the pressure of mimetic violence, although this disclosure has mostly been ignored. Paul Kahn, professor of law at Yale, suggests that Christ undermines the idea of sovereignty, and therefore sacrifice, by his universality, although our political systems remain mired in their own particularity. In either case, Christ functions as the potential but unrealized possibility of transcending the sacredness that ultimately causes violence. As in Barth, Christianity is, in some way, the religionless religion, and therefore marks a way beyond violence. In this essay, I want to offer a different model for the relationship between Christ, sovereignty, and sacrifice. Rather than separating Christ from sovereignty or sacredness, as Girard and Kahn do, I argue that Christ represents a form of sovereignty that is the negative correlate of political sovereignty. In the usual sense, the sovereign is the locus of collective power and identity. He or she represents the community and demands total and exclusive loyalty from that community. On the other hand, in Christ, sovereignty is dissolved into whatever lies external to the communal identity. Christ is not the simple absence or abolishment of sovereignty. Christ ends sacrificial violence by demanding loyalty on behalf of those outside of the community. He is a sovereign that has no location or identity, the non-sovereign, which is not the same as not being a sovereign. The work of Ren Girard is probably the most important route by which the sacrificial nature of violence has been introduced into current discourse. According to Girard, the mimetic nature of human desire means that communities always inevitably find themselves in a state of competition. We desire what our neighbor desires. Soon, even the object of desire is forgotten, and the competition itself becomes the object of focus. This competition obviously causes a crisis for the community because it threatens to destroy the social order. To resolve this tension, the community finds a scapegoat upon which it can agree to lay the blame for the perceived threat. Once the scapegoat is killed, the tension disappears, and the community perceives the victim as manifesting a sacred quality. The victim's death seems to have brought with it renewed life for the community. The victim becomes a part of the mythology that helps to explain the origins of the renewed social order, and is usually represented as a god who dies and is resurrected. The connection with Christianity is obvious, although Girard notes the Christian myth does something unique. It recognizes the innocence of the scapegoat, Christ, and refuses to ratify the act of violence against him. Christ is a unique victim because of his teaching and the circumstances around his execution, both of which warn against the dangers of mimetic violence. Jesus is the one human who refrains from violence, even in the face of death. Jesus is therefore the most innocent of all victims, which makes the choice of Jesus as scapegoat both inevitable and unjustifiable. The system of sacrifice that has served as the release valve for mimetic competition can no longer hide behind a mythology that justifies its violence. Girard sees the Gospels as providing an account of this unmasking of the sacrificial system. Unfortunately, Girard suggests, the original message of the Gospels was soon corrupted and made to function again as a sacrificial text. The letter of Hebrews, for instance, leads the way in interpreting Christ's death as a sacrifice to atone for human sin. And sacrifice is now a major category for understanding atonement, especially in Protestant discourse. These sacrificial interpretations respond to the superficial resemblance between Christ and other scapegoated victims, but miss the important element, which is that responsibility for that violence is placed on humans, not God. This is why the Gospels have not resulted in a widespread change in human culture, and in fact have been used against their original impulse to found a new culture just as sacrificial as before. The only difference now is that the Gospels, which contain the seed of the unmasking of sacrificial systems, have begun to erode the ability of violence to contain itself. So Girard thinks this may actually result in a multiplication of violence, at least until there is a widespread realization of its futility. In Girard's system, Christ is no longer a sacrifice, and therefore no longer sacred. Girard says, "I think that it is necessary to rid ourselves of the sacred, for the sacred plays no part in the death of Jesus." End quote. Girard interprets the Christian claim of the divinity of Jesus as referring to a potential that all humans have of relinquishing the cycle of mimetic violence. Jesus is God because he behaves in a uniquely divine manner. He is free from any stain of the founding violence. Girard's theory is therefore both naturalistic and orthodox. Jesus is fully human and fully divine. While Girard's theory gives a coherent account of the gospel narratives, and especially takes into account the nonviolent impulses of Christianity, he does so only by ignoring certain elements of Christian self-interpretation. Even if, as Girard says, quote, "In the first years of Christianity there existed a rigorous, though not yet explicit, intuition of the logic determining the gospel text," end quote. Still, early Christians had a very different picture of Christ than the one that Girard offers. In particular, the idea of Christ as Lord poses a problem for Girard because it introduces the idea of sovereignty, which in turn leads back to the idea of sacrifice. The connection between sovereignty and sacrifice is well developed in Girard's writing. According to Girard, the monarch is simply a reiteration of the sacrificial victim. The community always seeks to reproduce the efficacy of the scapegoat, and the scapegoat is the one who is endowed with the superhuman ability to create and destroy order. As Girard says, one must look to this prestige as the source for all political and religious sovereignty. End quote. So monarchy develops out of sacrifice as the interval between the selection of the scapegoat and his or her death is prolonged. This interval allows the victim to consolidate power and eventually to make any actual act of violence against the victim impossible. The king is therefore a sacrificial victim who has indefinitely deferred his execution. Girard says, "The spirit of kingship is the unanimous reconciliation that occurred spontaneously at the expense of a victim the king is now called upon to replace." End quote. Part of the function of sovereignty, therefore, is to demand total loyalty from its subjects in order to bring about the social order promised by sacrifice. Now, Girard would probably ask us to interpret the early Christian imputation of sovereignty to Christ in the same way that we would interpret the Passion narrative, as parallel to a sacrificial narrative, but with certain key differences. However, in this case there are several difficulties. For instance, the Gospels themselves make use of Christ's sovereignty in a more straightforward way than they do of Christ's sacrifice. Girard could legitimately argue that the sacrificial interpretation was a later corruption of the original Christian message. But the sovereignty of Christ appears to be an essential feature of the Gospels themselves. For instance, the Gospel of Matthew is written so as to portray Jesus as coming in the line of Jewish kings. Several of Paul's letters, even those thought to be authentic, contain the formula, Jesus is Lord. Probably the symbol of Christ as sovereign was one of the earliest intuitions of the Church. And unlike the parallels to sacrifice in the Gospels, there is no hint that the early Church wanted to undermine the concept of sovereignty itself. Certainly Christ was supposed to be an alternative to the sovereignty of Caesar, but this in no way reduced the concept of Christ's own sovereignty. The Church definitely owed to Christ their total loyalty. This is a problem not only because it would challenge Girard's claim to have found the original meaning of the Gospels, but also because it undermines the ability of Christ to motivate a resistance to violence. If Christ is not sacred, and therefore not a sovereign, then he is simply an innocent victim, deserving of pity or compassion, but not loyalty. The difference in language here, between compassion or loyalty, signifies a difference in the degree of one's stance against systems of violence, including the scapegoating mechanism. If one's objection to this system comes only as a response to an example of injustice, for instance, the story of the crucifixion in the Gospels, the compassion one feels may result in resistance up to a point, but it will not demand of you a total commitment to its eradication. This is precisely because total commitment is related to the concept of sovereignty. Only a sovereign can demand of its citizens loyalty to the point of self-sacrifice. A similar problem arises in the work of Paul Kahn, who locates the origins of violence in the sovereign's demand for sacrifice. In his book, Sacred Violence, Kahn argues that the capacity of American society to permit torture is a result of the strength of the concept of sovereignty. Unlike law, which seeks universal well-being for individuals, sovereignty demands absolute loyalty from its subjects, at the expense of those beyond its borders. In order to defend its own identity, the sovereign demands a sacrifice that transcends the ordinary purview of the law. The sovereign may, therefore, command a subject to kill or be killed on behalf of the political body. In democracies, the monarchical sovereign has been replaced by popular sovereignty, but this does not change the basic relationship between the individual citizen and the state, which can draft its citizens and ask them to die on its behalf. In fact, it is only when the sovereign has the ability to demand such a sacrifice, Kahn suggests, that it can truly sustain political identity. Torture is one particularly interesting example for Kahn because it illustrates the dilemma of the liberal state. On the one hand, the liberal state is committed to the universal principles of the law, which clearly prohibit the cruel and unusual types of violence that are usually labeled torture. On the other hand, torture is merely an extension of the logic of the battlefield. We seek to dominate the enemy in order to prove the power of the sovereign. And therefore we can hardly blame those who participate in torture without also indicting the entire system of warfare upon which political sovereignty is based. We can never quite solve this dilemma. Instead, we try to hide our use of torture as best we can, and scapegoat those most directly involved when these practices come to light. Although Kahn is pessimistic about escaping from the paradigm of sovereignty, he opposes this tendency with that of international law, which attempts to provide for universal well-being apart from any particular national or ethnic identity. There are, for instance, humanitarian projects that do not demand sacrifice from their participants, and therefore do not participate in systems of war and torture. Kahn says, we may loosely speak of sacrificing oneself for others, when we mean participation in public interest projects, both here and abroad. Admirable as these projects are, the meaning of sacrifice here has nothing to do with literal self-sacrifice. Indeed, just the opposite, for these are generally projects founded on a cosmopolitan idea of law and a universal conception of material well-being, not the killing and being killed of sacrificial politics." End quote. Kahn maintains the idea of universal law as an ideal that exists in tension with the realities of political sovereignty. Perhaps, he says, we might one day transcend nationalism in favor of a cosmopolitan identity. But this will only happen when states cease to feel threatened. In a world of terrorism and nuclear weapons, this seems like a distant dream indeed. Kahn notes that the tension between law and sovereignty can be symbolized with the respective figures of Abraham and Christ. Abraham is the paradigmatic example of the one who sacrifices on behalf of a sovereign in the construction of a particular identity. Christ is the example of universal love that transcends particularity and extends goodwill irrespective of borders. As Kahn says, the Western nation-state exists in a tension between the particularity of Abraham and the universality of Christ. We hold Christ's vision of universal justice and love as our ideal, but we cannot escape our own particularity, our willingness to kill and be killed to defend our sovereignty against other competing claims. Although Kahn takes a nuanced view of the relationship between the discourses of international law and nationalism, his acceptance of universality as an ideal prevents him from seeing the way that the Western project of universality may also contribute to the violence of particularity. Here, Talal Assad's analysis of terrorism is helpful. Assad notes that the definition of terrorism versus combat depends on a prior arbitrary distinction between civilized and uncivilized societies. He says, "It is not cruelty that matters in the distinction between terrorists and armies at war, still less the threat that each poses to entire ways of life, but their civilizational status. What is really at stake is not a clash of civilizations, but the fight of civilization against the uncivilized." End quote. Assad shows that the norms that are constructed as universal, such as human rights, international law, etc., may actually be used to perpetuate the ability of one group of people to use extreme force against another group. This distinction transcends national boundaries. We consider Western nations to be civilized, and therefore improper targets of excessive retaliation or torture. Only those who fail to cooperate with this universal vision, usually from the global south, are appropriate victims in the war on terror. In fact, Kahn's distinction between universal law and particular sovereignty is a false one. The most cosmopolitan vision can end up demanding sacrifice as much or more than the national sovereign. In fact, by promoting a loyalty to universal principles, one may create a sovereign that extends beyond the traditional notions or traditional borders of a nation. The result is a potential for even broader violence, this time directed against any who refuse to act by the norms of civilization. Both Girard and Kahn make use of the symbol of Christ to respond to the existence of sacrificial violence, but both fail in certain respects because of their separation of Christ and sovereignty. Clearly, Girard and Kahn show the desirability of making such a separation, since sovereignty is so closely related to violence. But each of them somehow allows violence to sneak back into their system. In Girard, the denial of the sacredness of Christ undermines the ability of that symbol to motivate resistance to violence. In Kahn, the universality of Christ masks the potential of that universal to set itself up as a sovereign of sovereigns, ushering in new modes of violence that are only more difficult to resist because they seem more justifiable. In order to transcend systems of violence, it is not enough to simply deny the sovereignty that founds political community. By itself, this merely produces either the insipid cosmopolitanism that withdraws in the face of an existential threat, or the militant defense of a universal ethos that only mimics the national sovereign on a broader scale. Instead, it is necessary to turn the concept of sovereignty inside out, so that the sovereign maintains its ability to demand, but represents those excluded from the political community rather than inside it. This requires a radical shift in identity, since the sovereign can no longer be grasped as a symbol of a distinct group. In fact, the sovereign now represents the space outside of one's own identity. This is a sovereign who requires loyalty on behalf of enemies, not against them. This is the sovereignty, or rather, non-sovereignty, that the Gospels attribute to Christ. One of the main features of sovereignty is its asymmetry, and Christian sovereignty is no different in this respect. Kahn himself nearly stumbles onto this. He remarks earlier in his book that sovereignty is characterized by the asymmetry of war, as opposed to the symmetry of legal rights. He says, as a set of legal rules, humanitarian law demands that each side in a conflict recognize the same rights and duties. But combat, as an activity of killing and being killed, moves according to a logic of asymmetry. Each side seeks the advantage. End quote. Later, he says that Christ also functions asymmetrically, although here he uses this to contrast Christ with the logic of sovereignty. It would be more consistent for Kahn to realize that Christ represents a form of sovereignty, but has reversed the asymmetry. Now the non-member is prioritized over the member of the community. Christ, as sovereign, is dissolved into the external. Phenomenologically, this means that the Christian meets his or her sovereign in the neighbor, especially the marginalized neighbor. The distinction between sovereign and enemy collapses as the king is manifested not just as an absence, but as immanentized in the other. Christ can, without contradiction, serve as Lord and also as outcast, as expressed in the parable of the sheep and the goats in the book of Matthew, where it says, "And the king will answer them, 'Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these, who are members of my family, you did it to me.'" The story here loses its power, either if the king were not truly sovereign, did not have authority, or if the king were not truly identified with the hungry, the stranger, and the imprisoned. Using Girard's definition of sacrifice, Christ does indeed represent an end to the sacrificial system. That is, Christ makes impossible the violence against the scapegoat that produces group cohesion. But this is accomplished through sovereignty, not against it. Precisely by the demand for sacrifice, in Kahn's sense, that comes from the outside, Christ's non-sovereignty actually destabilizes boundaries and borders, which makes Christ the anti-sacrifice in the Girardian sense. The demand of Christ's non-sovereignty is always toward non-violence, since the loyalty which was once reserved for the state now lies with those who could be potential objects of our violence. War becomes a type of treason in the Christian paradigm, even more serious than the usual form of treason, because there is by definition no hope of establishing a legitimate government in the place of the current one. The act of establishment is precisely what would make it unchristian. There is a reason that early Christian pacifism emerged out of a church that confessed Jesus as Lord. The connection between sovereignty and violence is strong and subtle, and it is for good reason that Girard and Kahn criticize this link. Yet sovereignty cannot simply be dismissed or condemned without giving up on ultimate loyalty, and therefore ultimate meaning. Sovereignty can only be overcome by an inversion of itself, which maintains its motivational power, but directs it in an opposite manner. This is the nonviolent symbol of Christ, the sovereign that we meet in the enemy. Thank you.